You ever have a conversation with someone about spirituality? At some point, they sort of get lost in translation. Now, I acknowledge that in this work, we often contemplate many spiritual dynamics that can come across as somewhat esoteric and not at all practical to someone not as familiar with these types of 5D New Age linguistics that we share amongst our tribes. You know, when we pass around phrases like, we're all one, or the light in me sees the light in you, and replacing a good morning with a sat nam, and substituting a goodbye with a namaste. And in result, we can be left with a sort of proverbial Freudian slip disguised as compassionate understanding from a stranger that has no idea what we're even talking about. So this was me the other day when I was having a conversation with a friend about the nature of consciousness. And from this subject arose a question. And that question was, well, how do we know that we're all one? And it dawned on me that every time I've explained oneness to someone, it was always within the confines of our tightly knit sort of spiritual community. And so this understanding of oneness was universally understood to not only be experientially true to most of us, but a fact. But for many of us, it didn't come as an idea which formed into a belief. It came as an intimate and unique experience that many of us had during mystical experiences or plant medicine ceremonies or these sort of momentary experiences of divine union in meditation. In other words, every person on this path gets a unique opportunity to not only understand oneness, but to feel it with every part of their being. Because it is an often lingering and lasting result of certain spiritual awakenings that each of us have. So when we speak of oneness, it is being communicated with words, yes, but it is experienced more often from our hearts. But how do we explain oneness to someone that is interested in the spiritual dimension, but doesn't necessarily have the context to feel it in the way that some of us do? Well, the first place that I would start is by exploring the idea of oneness first. So oneness essentially implies that you and I and every human being permeating this planet is one collective force. Okay, well, how can this be? Because if we're looking through the lenses of our eyes, it doesn't seem obvious that this is the case. For example, I live in Los Angeles. There are thousands of people living here. Each of those people have their own beliefs, their own ideas, their own friends, their own family, and they have their own sort of unique ways in which they perceive the world. And from this perspective, it seems like we have more differences than we do commonalities. So to try and extract oneness from this contrast typically is where the challenge kind of presents itself. But to reach this understanding of oneness doesn't at all imply that we should all like the same things or even understand life the same way. And this is where it can get kind of confusing. And the reason for this is because we often try and understand oneness through the lens of the cultural institution we call the ego. And as you know, the ego largely consists of a carefully crafted set of belief systems that often make us feel as though we are more different than we are the same. And there isn't anything wrong with this per se, but it's really in how you understand these beliefs that's important. So how you begin to understand oneness will largely depend on what type of relationship you have with your own ego. It will depend on how much stock you place in the ideas and the beliefs that the ego presents to you on a day-to-day basis. Because when we contemplate the idea of oneness with a mind conditioned to see people as separate, then it's really no surprise that we hit a wall with this whole oneness thing, because ego says, if I can't see it with my eyes, then how can it be true? How can it be true? Well, because we're looking for oneness from the wrong place and with the wrong set of eyes. And yes, you may experience oneness with your eyes, but it often doesn't start there. It starts from your heart. It starts with awareness. And if we can see oneness from this place first, then our eyes will sort of naturally adjust to seeing oneness in everything. Okay, so at this point, we get the feeling that ego is basically fucking everything up. And if we can get to this point, then I think a congratulations really is in order here, because if you can acknowledge that your ego has been secretively sabotaging your life in subtle ways, then this immediately opens us up to an entirely new possibility in our life. And that possibility is that maybe, just maybe, there's something more than just our ego moving inside our body. And maybe there's still something that moves within us when our mind is still and void of thought. But what is this force? This may be one of the most important questions we can ever ask ourselves. And it is a question that some may spend their entire lives trying to answer. And if you get the opportunity to explore this, then I definitely think it's a worthy journey to explore. But we still haven't quantified this whole oneness thing. But for the sake of this conversation, we're going to call this a knowable force, consciousness. Well, what is consciousness? There are a lot of theories about what consciousness is, but to simplify it, I'm going to give you the Hindu perspective on it. So in the Hindu Vedas, consciousness is defined by what they call Brahman, otherwise known as the cosmic principle. They believe Brahman to be the absolute ground of being. It is this one infinitely powerful force that permeates literally everything in existence. It would be the Christian equivalent to God, basically. And in the Vedas, they describe Brahman as Satchit Ananda, which basically means truth, consciousness, bliss. And they see this as the unchanging, permanent, highest reality that there is. But we have to be really careful with how we go about understanding this concept of Brahman, because the one thing that Hinduism doesn't want us to get preoccupied with is thinking that we can accurately define this force with words, because we can't. Jiddu Krishnamurti talks about this all the time. The word is not the thing. Well, why is this? Well, because in their tradition, God or Brahman can't be defined. It can only be experienced. Okay, so Brahman is essentially consciousness. And why is this relevant? Well, because consciousness is a quality that we all have as humans. And because this is a quality we all have as humans, finally we have something that we all share common ground in, which is consciousness. One thing that we begin to discover along our path into spirituality is how consciousness seems to work in us as humans. When we are born as humans, we are all born with consciousness, right? Consciousness is this undeniable and experiential feeling that we exist and that we are aware that we exist. And the beautiful and profound thing about consciousness is that it exists independent of anything we're taught following our birth. For example, when we're born, we don't understand language, yet we know how to breathe, we know how to eat, we know that what we want to be is alive. So where does this knowing come from? I mean, obviously, it's not taught behavior. I think that this is consciousness. And at its core, consciousness exists within the realm of pure experience and awareness. And the ironic thing about this is that this is an experience that many people on this path are trying desperately to find, not even realizing that we can't find it. Well, why is this? Because we're already looking from this place. And if we're already perceiving life through consciousness, then it doesn't matter how many hours we spend sort of bending ourselves into a pretzel on our yoga mat, we're not going to find it because we're already there. And this is one of the most important realizations that we can come to on our path, because then we realize how much of our ego's conditioning we've sort of been buying into. So the ego sold us this dream, or maybe even an expectation about how enlightenment was supposed to play out. And after years of trying to find God, we realized sometimes in a split second that what we were looking for was already the place that we were looking from. Because this is what the ego does. And the sooner we realize this, the sooner we can begin to see past all of the conditioning that the ego has placed within the field of our awareness, sort of obscuring our ability to see God within ourselves, and as a result, obscuring our ability to see God in everyone else. So how do we see each other as one? Well, first we need to identify all of the things preventing us from experiencing each other as one. These can be our beliefs about others, ourselves, the world, the nature of reality. Basically, anything the ego can come up with conceptually about God and life cannot be who we are. Well, why is this? Because all of these beliefs and ideas we have are streams of information passed down and programmed into us by other people. We didn't come into life with these beliefs. These ideas came as a result of our attempt to understand the world around us. And this is where the ego needs to get some credit, because it's not bad to have an ego. In order for consciousness to exist within this reality, we need an ego to sort of ground us into this life and allow us the ability to do certain things. I mean, if we didn't have an ego, we would just be this sort of exploding sphere of untamed energy, shooting off in all directions. So an ego allows us this sort of unique ability to experience life in a certain way. But the issue comes when we fall asleep to our sort of inward divinity and become dependent on our ego to move us through life and answer for us in situations where our spirit really needs to answer for us instead. So it's important to realize that nothing the ego can say or do can be really who we are. And why would you want to take your advice from something as ephemeral as an ego? Because just like our bodies eventually die, our egos, sort of being a part of our neural network of logic and reason, also die with it. But what doesn't die is consciousness. And because consciousness is something we all have in common, because it's something that we all share, we can begin seeing each other and every person in our lives as one force, and not as an idea or as a belief, but as a sort of experiential knowing that we exist. Because when we breathe together. When we live together. When we die together. And when we love together. This is consciousness. And any belief or idea or concept that you decide to build on top of that understanding, that is completely up to you.